Hello, symposiasts, and happy Samhain, Halloween, or however you celebrate this time of the year. It's me, as always, Dr. Puca, being always the most serious self that I can be. And welcome to the academic study of magic, esotericism, paganism, shamanism, and all things occult. So today we are going to talk about the history, folklore, traditions, evolution, historical evolution of Samhain and Halloween in a way, with a friend and colleague that I'm gonna bring on now. Hello, Jennifer.
Hello. Hi.
You guys may remember her. I mean, you were probably the very first interview that I did on this channel, like
Certainly
a
one of
long way.
yeah.
Was on, I think it was on Woody's Druidry.
That's
But
right.
yeah, so tell us something about yourself for those of that are listening and don't know you.
Okay, so my name is Jenny Uzzell. I have a doctorate from the University of Durham in the anthropology of religion, specifically looking at modern British Druids and the ritualization of death. And when I'm not doing academic things, I co-own a progressive funeral home. So doing the ritualization of death. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, I think.
Yeah, so that's perfect for Samhain. This time of the year, by the way.
Yeah, it is.
Mm.
It's great.
So we were thinking of. I will give you guys a little bit of an introduction on the history of Samhain, and then we will have a discussion over it. I thought that this would be a more structured way to present you with some information. So let's start then. So Samhain, this is, by the way, the modern Irish pronunciation. It's not clear what the old Irish pronunciation would be. And this is from what I recall that Dr. Johnny Butler told me, who's obviously an expert in on all things Irish paganism. So Samhain, as a historical and contemporary festival, is rooted in the agricultural and seasonal cycles of the Celtic calendar. And we will also clarify what we mean by that. Celebrated as a liminal period marking the transition between the light and dark halves of the year. The celebration of Samhain is primarily associated with the Gaels, which includes the Irish, Scottish, and Manx people. And historically, it was one of the four main festivals of the Celtic year, alongside Imbolc, Beltane, and Lunasa. It marked the beginning of the dark half of the year and a period when pastoral communities would bring livestock in from summer pastures and prepare for the challenges of the winter. Archaeological and literary evidence, including early Irish texts, describes Samhain as a critical period for gathering the community, holding assemblies and also potentially performing rituals to appease supernatural forces or honor the dead. These gatherings were seen as a period of liminality, during which boundaries between the human and what we would say supernatural worlds were believed to be more permeable, allowing spirits, ancestors, and other entities to cross into the human world. The earliest mentions of Samhain in Irish literature date back to the 10th century, but the celebration is believed to have ancient pre-Christian origins. Now, what is the evidence for the antiquity of? Oh, sorry, I'm here. What's the evidence for the antiquity of Samhain? The evidence for the antiquity of Samhain comes from several sources. One is Irish mythology, because many stories in the Irish mythological cycle, such as the Ulster cycle and the mythological cycle, mention Samhain as a significant time of the year associated with supernatural type of events. Then we have medieval texts, because Samhain is mentioned in early Irish literature, such as the 10th century tale that I don't know how to pronounce, Tokmark Emir, and the 12th century saga Meska Ulad. And also there's some linguistic evidence, because the word Samhain is likely derived from the Old Irish Samhain. It's not clear how it is pronounced. It's S-A-M-A-I-N. which comes from the... Sorry? Oh, I thought you said something. Okay. Which comes from the Proto-Celtic Samoni. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, meaning assembly. Now, in ancient times, what were the practices and the customs that were associated with Samhain? Because obviously nowadays we are more familiar with the customs and traditions and practices that are associated with contemporary paganism and the reinterpretations of Samhain. But what were the practices associated with Samhain in ancient times? So we have bonfires. Large bonfires were likely lit, and their flames, smoke, and ashes were deemed to have protective and cleansing powers. Then we have feasting, because Samhain was likely a time for gatherings and feasts, during which the souls of the dead were believed to return to the mortal world. Then we have divination, because methods of divination such as apple bobbing and dream interpretation were used to foretell the future and gain insight into the coming year. And also offerings, food offerings were left for the fairies and the spirits of the dead. However, it is important to note that our understanding of ancient Samhain practices is limited by the scarcity of written records from pre-Christian times, and the fact that most early accounts were recorded by Christian monks centuries later. So many of these accounts may have been influenced by Christian biases and interpretations. Samhain also features prominently in Irish mythology as seen in tales from the Ulster cycle and the mythological cycle. According to these narratives, Samhain was a time of supernatural happenings and heroic feats, where characters would confront otherworldly beings or venture into mystical realms. For instance, the cattle raid of Cooley begins during Samhain and highlights the period's association with power struggles and supernatural conflict. Ritual practices during Samhain likely involved fire as a central element. Fire festivals, such as the lighting of bonfires, may have symbolized protection and purification for both people and livestock. The ritualistic use of fire, along with divination practices, were essential elements that allowed people to symbolically negotiate their relationship with death and the other world, themes that continue in modern pagan practices. In medieval Europe, as Christianity spread, Samhain's themes were absorbed and transformed. The Church established All Saints' Day on November the 1st, possibly as an attempt to Christianize the pre-existing pagan festival, though that's uncertain. This Christian holiday, along with All Souls' Day on November the 2nd, highlighted remembrance of the dead and veneration of saints, thereby incorporating Samhain's association with the dead and the other world. Over time, syncretic traditions developed, blending pre-Christian and Christian elements. The association with spirits, death, and the supernatural persisted, though these traditions became reshaped within a Christian framework and later within folk traditions, particularly in rural Ireland and Scotland. Then we come to the revival in contemporary paganism. Samhain has been reinterpreted and revived within the 20th century pagan movement, particularly by Wiccan practitioners. Gerald, Gardner, and other early Wiccan figures in the mid-20th century incorporated Samhain as one of the 8 Sabbats of the Wiccan Wheel of the Year. In contemporary paganism, Samhain is often celebrated as a time for ancestor veneration, divination, and meditation on death and rebirth. Modern pagans celebrate Samhain in various ways, including the use of altars, offerings to ancestors, and ritualized storytelling to honor the dead. These practices are informed both by historical sources and by the personal spiritual needs of the practitioner. The modern adaptation of Samhain reflects a shift towards individual spiritual engagement with themes of mortality, continuity, and transformation. So to conclude this little talk, the historical timeline is that Samhain originated as a Celtic festival, marking the end of harvest and the beginning of winter, with themes of death, ancestors, and otherworldly or supernatural beings. Then we have the Christianization, which is the transformation through Christian syncretism that incorporates All Saints and All Souls Day, which maintain the focus on the dead. And there was sort of a mixture of the two in a way, in a form of syncretism. Then in medieval and early modern Europe, we have practices like souling and guising, which kept alive elements of both Samhain and Christian remembrance of the dead. Then we have the Halloween in America, which was developed in the 19th century and was brought in by immigrants from Ireland and Scotland. And it developed into a secular, community-oriented holiday with customs that reflect Samhain, but also medieval Christian traditions, such as costumes and the jack-o'-lanterns. And then we have the contemporary pagan Samhain, which was revived by Wiccans and modern pagans as a spiritual holiday, distinct from Halloween, with a focus on ancestral veneration and personal introspection. And here are some references. So, what do you think, Jenny?
I think the first thing that comes out of that for me is that the idea, certainly Samhain is a very ancient festival amongst Celtic peoples that marked, as you say, the beginning of the dark half of the year and the final harvest. There doesn't seem to be, certainly it does seem to be a time when the veil was thin, when the other world was close, where heroes meet with presumably divine beings. It's very difficult to tell because, as you say, the sources are written by Christians. So the exact relationship between ancient gods and the characters in, for example, the Toyn are very difficult to pin down. What there doesn't seem to be is definite evidence that Samhain amongst pre-Christians was specifically connected with the dead or any expectation of the return of the dead any more than any other time of year. I believe Hutton suggests that if there was a time of year when that was likely, it was more likely Midsummer's Eve. There seems to be a bit more evidence for that. And in terms of the establishment of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day as ways of Christianizing pre-existing pagan festivals, again, annoyingly, because it would be lovely, there seems to be very little evidence for that. My opinion is that most likely Halloween, All Hallows Eve, the eve of All Saints' Day, is a Christian festival, which is quite funny given that some elements of Christianity sort of denounce it as being very dark and dangerous and satanic, but it is in fact a Christian festival that in more modern times, certainly since Gardner, has been, I don't want to quite say the word appropriated because it feels critical and it's not critical, has been used by modern paganism as something that is very much in line with its own ideas and has become, as you say, a hugely important festival in modern paganism. I mean, for me, it is the most important of the 8 festivals. So yeah, I think it's one of those cases where it doesn't really matter so much where it came from in terms of modern pagan practice as where it ended up. And certainly, you know, paganism's taken a lot from Christianity in this regard. But I think its origins are very much in Catholic Christianity and the desire to try to help souls that are in purgatory. This seems to be what's at the heart of Halloween as a Christian festival, as an originally Catholic festival, as a way of, out of charity, helping souls that are in purgatory out of purgatory and into heaven. So in that case, you know, your care for your own ancestors, your own dead, becomes central in that regard.
Yeah, I presented the research that is out there on the topic, but I'm familiar with Ronald Hudson's take on that, and I actually agree. I think that there are definitely sources that talk about the some association with liminality and death,
Yes.
which are the sources that Gerald Gardner has taken, and those are the elements that he, in a way, overemphasized
Yeah.
But then Ronald Hutton is the historian that has pointed out that those elements of liminality and connection with the dead are actually more, the one with that is linked to Christianity and syncretization with Christianity during the medieval times. But there were scholars that Gerald Gardner obviously referenced, like Sir John Rice and Fraser and also Murray. These were all scholars that now have been, I don't want to say debunked because it sounds like, but they have been revisited by more recent historical scholarship. So yeah, at the end of the day, I agree that among the takes that we have, the most persuasive one is the one that Professor Hutton has given, and that and this means that Samhain, the way that has been conceptualized in modern paganism, also owes something to Christianity, because there are elements from the pre-Christian times, but there are also elements from the Christianization period, we
Yeah.
can say, of those folk practices, which makes sense because I think that folk practices always absorb something of the period, of the time period, of the culture. So even when I've heard people criticizing Wicca, saying, "Oh, the rituals in Gardnerian Wicca are so Christian because they have elements from ceremonial magic, and ceremonial magic obviously had elements of Christianity."
Yeah.
But I think that's unavoidable because that's
Mhm.
the only reference that he had at the time.
Yeah, and it's the way human beings work. I mean, that I don't think there is such a thing in the world as a pure and syncretized religion. It just isn't the way human beings work. But yeah, it's that in itself is not in any way derogatory to paganism. And I think
No.
there has been this tendency, I think, amongst both pagans and Christians to try and put up this hard, unpassable wall and say, this is pagan and this is Christian. And actually, there is this fascinating liminal space between the two, and certainly historically, that I think is much more interesting than, just saying this is pagan, this is Christian. And, it's an absolutely fascinating area. I think what we forget is that certainly in the early Middle Ages, the Christian worldview was enchanted. It was inhabited by supernatural beings that sort of passed out of the consciousness of a lot of people after the Enlightenment. So, Christian magic, and there is Christian magic, deals with problems like elves and elf shot and how to protect yourself against all these supernatural scary things that are out there. And as Samhain and Halloween rituals, and in Wales, of course, as well, Nos Calan Gaeaf, which is as Samhain, the beginning of winter, there are all of these rituals, all of these folk practices that are basically protective, because there are things walking out there that might not be terribly friendly, and you need a way of protecting yourself against them, whether you're a pagan or a Christian. And this worldview that says those things don't exist didn't really start to become prominent until the Enlightenment.
Which again tells us something about how all religions get influenced by the cultural zeitgeist, because even Christianity was influenced by the secularization, and so was paganism and esotericism in general, with a tendency to adopting the psychological model where entities were in your head and they were archetypes. So I think that I agree with you. I think that Samhain, just as the other Sabbats of the Wheel of the Year, are a testament to the permeability of religious practices,
Yes.
and how permeable they are to other religions, other adjacent religions that cohabit the same time and space, and also the tendencies, the trends that you have at the time more broadly in terms of a culture. I mean, in a pre-secular, even though there are people that also challenge the notion that we live in a secular age, like the sociologist Peter Berger, and say that actually we live in a pluralistic age, but at least institutions have become secularized, and there's value in I would say that there is some form of secularization definitely has occurred progressively after the Enlightenment, so all these trends, all these cultural waves and religious waves tend to influence each other and influence the different religions. So I agree with you that even though Christianity is clearly distinct from paganism, but it would be really impossible to think that one hasn't influenced the other, and in both ways, not in both cases, not just in the case of
two-way
paganism.
road, definitely, yeah. All the way back to the mystery religions, it's been a two-way road, I think.
Yeah. So what do you think about so if you were to sum up the history of Samhain, how would you summarize it?
I think as it exists today, it has its origins in Halloween, All Hallows Eve, Catholic festival that had to do initially with the honouring of martyrs, of course. All Hallows was the saints, the martyrs, and then All Souls Day with the more wider honouring of the dead, and a sort of a concentrated attempt to try and help people out of purgatory. Well, that leaves you thinking about purgatory, and from this period, from about the 10th century, I would say, certainly up until the 13th, you start to get a lot of ghost stories around All Hallows that are usually, and actually, a lady called Susan Owen, I think, did a wonderful book called I'm trying to remember exactly what it was called. I'll find it in a minute, but it's a cultural history of ghost stories, and it's a fascinating book. And it doesn't deal with whether do ghosts exist or not. That's a non-issue. The issue is how have ghost stories been used historically, and in what context have they been used. And the earliest ones have to do with purgatory. They have to do with people being interrupted on a journey by a supernatural being that requests something of them that will help them to get out of purgatory. And this, of course, leads on to stories about things like the Wild Hunt and people encountering ghostly parades and processions around this time of year. Well, these then being acted out. So you then have your people sort of dressing up as ghosts. All of this is essentially Christian. Though, obviously not all Christians would recognize it as Christian. All of this is essentially, Christian practice. And it has to do with protecting yourself from the unsaved souls, the unbaptized souls, the souls in purgatory who are likely to be abroad and out and potentially dangerous at that time of year. And also charity. How are you going to help them? And of course, this is where you get traditions like soul cakes, where you get traditions like guising, where people are going around asking for money, because there is this really strong tradition in pre-Enlightenment Catholic theology that and it comes out in things like the Lwyd dirge, that by giving charity to the people that are alive, you are lessening your own time in purgatory, and you are potentially easing also the time that your relatives spend in purgatory. So you then get this connection with things that have become from the American tradition, trick or treating. All of these things developing. And then I would say over the last 50, 60 years, 70 years at a push, you have modern paganism sort of coming onto the scene and seeing all of this and seeing echoes of what certainly looks and feels like an ancient tradition of connection with the dead, with the other world. And because, of course, ancestors are such a huge part, certainly of Druidry, which is my discipline, but in paganism more widely, connection with ancestors is hugely important. And to therefore have a festival which allows you, as you go into the dark part of the year, to be connecting and honouring and remembering your ancestors, however they are conceived. Because, of course, in paganism, ancestors are not only blood ancestors. There's other ways of understanding ancestors as well. But to have a festival that encourages those things at this time of year is hugely useful. And so various traditions, folk customs that were not initially pagan have been adapted and used by pagans in a way that is hugely and deeply meaningful. And I'm thinking here of things such as the Dumb Supper, the Merry Lwyd, which traditionally was associated more around Christmas and New Year, but in pagan circles has started to, from Samhain onwards, the Merry Lwyd is a big thing. And all of these ceremonies that are held to name and honor and commemorate the dead and bring them into memory, all of these things become hugely significant for pagans at this time of year.
When you talked about folk tales of encountering spirits, but we also have accounts of encountering spirits outside of the concept of purgatory, even before the Christianization. Even in Greece and in Rome. There are many tales that that talk about encounters with various spirits to gain insight. Not necessarily to help them in their journey in the afterlife.
There is definitely a trope. There is definitely a trope from around, the 11th, 12th century where that is a common thing, and it often isn't actually a person. It's often an animal form that people encounter initially. But
yeah, but in ancient history we do have accounts
Yes.
of that. Like, for instance, in the Roman festival of Lemuria involved rituals to appease and keep spirits away from households.
Yeah.
So in this case, the focus was keeping boundaries between the living and the dead, rather than helping spirits reach an afterlife destination. Then we also have the Homeric Odyssey, where Odysseus encounters various spirits in the underworld to gain insight into his journey, and so on. There are many occurrences of the sort. So just to clarify that, maybe you meant more from the medieval time that it starts to become more of a more common.
Yes, if you go into the very ancient world, then yes, of course, and even back into the Sumerian, there are some fabulous ghost stories and stories about laying ghosts and sort of keeping ghosts away from houses. And Irving Finkel's work there is very entertaining and very informative, actually, about the attitude to the dead in ancient Sumeria. I think he cites one of the oldest references that we have written anywhere to a ghost comes from a letter from a merchant who is trying to get prices for wool out of another merchant. And the letter says, I've done everything. I've written to you. I've asked people to ask you. I've done this. I've even consulted the dead in the temple, and I still don't know what your wool costs, which is fascinating because it shows that this is a practice that people did, that there was a way of consulting the dead as a form of divination, which of course continues into modern Samhain practices through, as you said, apple bobbing, cutting an apple in half and reading from the seeds, apple peel. Apples actually seem to be inherently very deeply connected with ideas of the underworld, both in Celtic tradition, in Greek and Roman tradition. Apples are something that seems to be very closely associated with the underworld, and therefore with this time of year.
And what do you think were the, based on your knowledge and which scholarship do you find more persuasive? Which do you think were the practices in the pre-Celtic, in the Celtic times, in ancient times, and how do they differ from contemporary paganism, which we have already established they have been syncretized? I think there was actually a question from Vocatus saying, would you go as far as calling it syncretism? Probably, maybe not like conscious. I don't know. What do you think?
I think borrowing is quite a good word in this context. I think syncretism doesn't necessarily describe something that's done deliberately there. Syncretism is what happens when you put two religious traditions close to each other, almost by osmosis. But I think there has been borrowing of ideas backwards and forwards across both. I think, as you said, it's very difficult to know exactly what the pre-Christian Celts were doing because we don't have any records from them directly. Everything that we have is written down by Christians. And as Mark Williams points out, they are literary accounts that were written as literary accounts, very often with a Christian message behind them, which makes it even harder. So whereas undoubtedly there are pre-Christian glimpses in there, it is very, very difficult to work out exactly what they are. I think bonfires we can be reasonably certain of, and that those had a protective and a purifying purpose. That seems to be fairly universal, but again, of course, that's not unique to Samhain because you have, the fire festivals. You have fires at Beltane, you have fires on Midsummer's Eve. So fires is something that you do.
Yeah, it's the same
because it's something that is purifying, it's something that's protective, it's something that keeps the dark out, and I think that's kind of where it comes from. That's at the heart of it.
Yeah, it's the same with reports of the connection with the dead and the ancestors. That doesn't necessarily imply that, if there were practices towards the ancestors, it doesn't imply that there was the time of the year to connect with the ancestors. Those are two different statements.
Yes.
So if there were practices done with the dead and with the ancestors, that doesn't mean that that would be considered the time to do that, as it is in Wicca.
Yeah.
So,
and of course, it's a really difficult period. The Iron Age, the pre-Christian, pre-Roman Iron Age, is a very difficult period to be talking about ideas about the dead. That the later Christianized records give us a very strong clue that there was this idea of the underworld, Anun, Anuvan, somewhere that was parallel but different to their everyday life. That was a place where supernatural beings and possibly, but not definitely, the dead were. But beyond that, and the archaeology there doesn't really help us. If you go back further, if you go to the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, for example, we have no written records, obviously, but we have some really, really interesting archaeology that suggests to us how people were relating to their ancestors during that period. In a very visceral way, they seem to have been actually manipulating the bodies of their ancestors in ways that they may have been connected with divination, they may not have been, but certainly there's evidence that people were carrying bits of the dead around with them, that people are being buried with parts of skeletons that are 2 or 3 generations older than they are. So yeah, we've got some really interesting archaeological insights for before, and we've got some interesting written insights from afterwards. But that exact period, we've got very little to go on.
So yeah, it's always difficult to talk. I think I always find that when there are mentions of Celtic traditions and Celtic history, is always difficult.
It's really tricky.
Because even the concept of Celts and Celtic is quite controversial.
It's really difficult, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it is something that is still talked about quite a bit. By the way, could you please turn off? You have a notification that is going off every so
sorry,
often.
I don't quite know how to do that. Hopefully that's done it. We'll see. We'll see. That's on the computer. I'm afraid I don't have a separate microphone at this point.
So, and what do you think about Samhain in contemporary paganism? What do you think? How about how it was developed and how it is practiced today?
I think it is, for a lot of pagans, it is one of, if not the most important of the 8 festivals. A lot of pagans, of course, and this is going off the back of Fraser, who was probably wrong, but that doesn't make it any less useful now, take Samhain as the beginning of the new year. So for a lot of people, this is actually the new year. I think it is hugely significant. I think there's something inherently and innately, and we've been talking about, you know, whether it was or wasn't a time for the dead in the pre-Christian past, there is something innately uncanny, I think, just about this time of year, when, you know, the nights do start getting darker earlier and there's still a bit of warmth, but you know what's coming. And it's a very frightening time. And I think we also forget about our ancestors, how much darkness they were dealing with that never crosses our minds to think about, because we've got electric light. And I think we forget very, very quickly exactly how life-changing electric light is. And I think there's just always been something uncanny and unsettling. And I think that's still there. There's something you kind of feel in your bones at this time of year. And I think a lot of the things that pagans do to celebrate this time of year, a lot of them are very recent, very recent. One of the ones that is going on this evening is no older than lockdown. And that's a friend of mine, Lucy Wright, who is a Morris dancer and a folklorist and an artist, who during lockdown was encouraging people to dance the sun up, which isn't a thing that Morris dancers have been doing for a long time, and post to Instagram. And in the last 2 or 3 years, she's been doing the same thing with what she calls dusking. Now, there is no tradition of dusking in Morris. This is a new thing that she's invented, to dance the sun down, to basically say goodbye to the sun at the beginning of the dark half of the year. And she's running an event on Instagram where people can film themselves dancing the sun down and post it to her site. So there's a very, very recent one that is, it's not specifically pagan, but there's a lot of pagans involved with it. That is, again, not specifically celebrating the dead, but celebrating the end of summer, celebrating the beginning of the dark. Then there's others. We've got, of course, the Dark Gathering, which has just happened in Tintagel this weekend, just gone. Now, this is something I'm deeply interested in, the Mary Lwyd. This is also presumably a originally Christian tradition, something that has its origins in South Wales, where people take a horse's skull on a stick around houses and pubs, and with the use of a punko, which is a poetic challenge, asked to be let in. And if they're let in, then the Mary, I have a Mary, here's one I created earlier. Well, I didn't actually. This one is cardboard.
Let me just, okay.
This
You created it. Wow.
Well, I did a lot of the decorating. This is actually from a cardboard kit that you can get from the Museum of Wales. And this one was actually put together for us by David Pitt, who's the guy that designed the kit. But this one, and she claps. So I'm trying to get this in screen. And there's a pole that goes up. She's got a post hole up there. And you can, we actually had her out at Thornborough Henge a few weeks ago. And she's carried around from door to door. And there is, as I say, this contest, and she comes in and causes mischief and knocks things over. And she has sort of been adopted by pagans. The Anglesey Druid Order is the key one. They have Mary Mon, who was woken up this weekend, just gone, and is seen very often as and this is true in the Dark Gathering as well in Tintagel, as a direct link to the ancestors. And the Mary is seen almost as a psychopomp, as a link between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and a way that communication can be opened between the two. So there's a really clear example of something that has been going on, to our certain knowledge, since 1800. I think the earliest written reference to it is 1800, but we don't know how long before that it was going on. But certainly it's in the last 20 years or so that has become something, and probably in the last 2 or 3 years it's taken off in a big way in Wales and outside of Wales, as a thing that pagans do at this time of year. And the Dark Gathering, you have Marys coming from all over the country, from Cornwall, from Wales, and meeting, and there is a big celebration of the ancestors and connection with the ancestors. So again, there's all sorts of things that haven't been pagan that kind of are now. And again, here I'm very much very much convinced by the research that Andy Lecture has done on this point, about folk traditions and folk laws that in the 70s were widely believed to be pagan survivals. And that idea has been largely debunked. Most of them we know are not much older than the 1700s. Some of them are older than that. The earliest references we have to Morris dancing, I think, are from the 1400s. But they're not pre-Christian and they're not pagan. But they are now. And this is the scholarship that Lecture is presenting very much, that these things have been paganized and have become part of the pagan worldview and the pagan way. And I think this is a mistake that scholars often make, that there is this false notion of authenticity, that in order to be genuine, something has to be ancient. And I think that's something we need to be very careful of, because all religions were new once. And all religions that were new once, including Christianity, drew on the religious milieu around it at the time they were being created in order to become what they were. So yes, these traditions and the way that people are celebrating Samhain now, a lot of them are very recent and very modern, and they work. They work very well for people on the psychological, on the spiritual level. They help people to connect to the past. A lot of Samhain rituals help people to accommodate and use their grief. So a lot of Samhain ritual commemorates, mentions, remembers people who have died in the last year. So a lot of Samhain ceremonies actually name and remember the people that have been lost to that group in that year. And whereas in wider society, we have funerals and we remember people at funerals, and then it tends to stop. And that connection with that person is easily lost. And I think one of the really strong, useful things about Samhain ceremonies is because they keep that bond going. It means that each year you're revisiting, re-remembering, reconnecting with that person, re-establishing that relationship, rather than, oh, that person died, they had a funeral, let's move on. It's this continuing to relate to that person that I think is one of the really strong things, and one of the things, actually, one of the ways in which paganism has something to offer to the wider world outside of paganism, that this is a way of ritualizing that is really helpful and really healthy and really beneficial.
I totally agree. I just see that the mistake around authenticity is made more by the general public than by scholars. In my personal experience, it tends to be more the practitioners that tend to think, "Oh, I have to claim that Samhain is the oldest practice ever. Otherwise,
Yes.
it's not.
Or it's not.
Otherwise,
Yes, absolutely.
otherwise it's not authentic. Otherwise, it's not valuable." And a lot of what I've done on my YouTube channel, especially in relation to paganism, was debunking the antiquity of of many of these claims,
Yeah.
which obviously is not something that I made up, because there
Of course.
has, I'm just presenting the scholarship that is there on the topic. But
Yeah.
yeah, I just and sometimes I get comments of people that are either angry or they are saddened by it. And I always try to remind people that the fact that something is more ancient doesn't make it more effective. You could
Yes.
even argue the exact opposite. You
Of
could
course.
say, given that, I mean, you wouldn't think that of technology. You wouldn't say, "Oh, this computer is from the 1980s, so it's definitely more effective." So you wouldn't think that of technology. Why would you think that of magic practices and rituals? I mean, we need to be sensitive to the fact that spiritual practices respond to contemporary needs, and the needs that we have today are not the needs that our ancestors had 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago. So
Yeah.
as you said, I mean, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say we live in a very different world, and our concerns are different to their concerns. And I sometimes wonder. I don't know much, for example, about Hellenistic paganism. I do wonder if Mercury now is more often called in to help with problems with computers. This would seem to be a reasonable evolution of a pagan worldview into the concerns and the issues and the worries that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, this might be a hot take, but I would also say that many of the so-called more ancient religions, the way that they are lived and practiced now, they are not so ancient after
It's
all.
very
They
different, yes.
they keep the same name, they go under the same brand, but they've gone through various rebranding over time to the
Yes.
point where the one that they are practicing now is not the
It's,
same
it's
as
very
it was
yeah,
500 years ago. So
yes.
can you really say that that religion is that old? I mean, it is that old because it has maintained the same name, but it's also important to acknowledge the fact that it has definitely changed over time for good reasons. So
Yes.
it's
Yes. I
not
mean,
an accusation.
it has roots. I mean, I'm thinking here the ones that immediately spring to mind, apart from Christianity, Judaism, and Hinduism, of course. Hinduism is the obvious one there. They are ancient in the state, in the sense that they have an unbroken line of continuity. They have very, very ancient roots, but they've changed, and of course they've changed. And people suggesting that what modern pagans are doing is the same as what Iron Age pagans were doing. Well, I really hope it isn't, because I'm reasonably certain that they were sacrificing people on a fairly regular basis, and that's really not somewhere we want to go. So yeah, religion changes. It changes because the world changes, and it changes because what people need from it changes.
Yeah. So I like the fact that so in a way we could also say that paganism is because some people say, oh, it's made up because it's a new religious movement. Well, you could argue that perhaps it's something that human beings need now then. And so
It's
uh
very well fitted to the modern zeitgeist. I mean, with the emphasis that we've got on ecology and on the need to preserve the planet, and everything that paganisms have to say about the divinity of nature and the veneration of nature, it's a religion that is very much, or a set of religions, or a set of spiritual practices, however you prefer to put it, that is very much in line with the world of today. You could almost say it's something whose time has come.
mm. And in a way, I think that given that paganism is very often defined as an earth-centered or an earth-worshipping religion, you could argue that maybe paganism responds to a spiritual need of today's people. Because when you get your apples and your fruit and vegetable at the supermarket, you forget that that comes from a tree.
Yes.
So paganism allows practitioners, people, pagans, to reconnect with the source of everything that is around us, which is nature. So perhaps in the past, when people were much more immersed in nature than we are today, they had less of a need, both physically and spiritually, to have that type of religiosity.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Mm. And Dave is saying we just sacrifice people economically and socially.
Yeah, fair point.
But yeah, I think that I always think that this time of the year is has something magical to it, and also I think that it's interesting how the two probably most important festivals of the year are during the dark time of the year. You know, Christmas and Halloween or Samhain, and
It's
I
only
think
when you need something, isn't it, to keep you going? You need some sort of promise of things to come, and light, of course. These festivals are all to do with light, right when you have least of it, and that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, especially, you know, when you think about the fact that luckily we have electric lights now, but
Yeah.
if you didn't have electric lights, it would be really, really daunting
Yes.
to live through months and months of darkness. So
And when you think about people being frightened at this time of year and this sense of unease, and then you think yourself back into a world that is that dark. And I've seen some of the records from around the 1200s of cause of death, sort of causes of death in a lot of the villages, and you would be amazed how often falling into a hole or falling into a ditch or falling down something crops up at that time. And you think, if you're out at night, you know, in a world that is that dark, and yeah, and sometimes the number of people that just meet their end falling down something outside, and you get to get an idea that whereas for us, certainly the modern secular festival of Halloween is very much about fun, and it's about those sort of scares that you want to have, that keep you connected to things, that remind you that you're alive. But actually, if you go back into a very dark world where belief in the supernatural was far more common, then that fear becomes much more pervasive and much more oppressive. And the need for things that are going to protect you, like lighting fires, becomes much more obvious.
yeah, absolutely. And so based on your knowledge, because you're also a scholar of contemporary paganism and especially, well, Druidry. So how do contemporary pagans and druids celebrate this time of the year?
Okay, a couple of them I've already mentioned. So there's a lot of Druid involvement with things like the Mary Lwyd, the Dark Gathering, the Samhain Festival in Edinburgh, the Beltane Fire Society do a wonderful event up there. So there's various events around that you can go to. I know the Darkthorn Ritualistic Group, previously Darkthorn Border Morris. So again, some but not all Morris sides, particularly Border Morris sides, particularly Border Morris sides in the southwest of England and Wales. I'm going to be that specific, but there are some. There's one in Lancashire that I know of. Dance in the Winter, and they have this idea of Morris as marking the turning of the year, marking the moving of the wheel. So there's quite a lot of that. There's a tradition that's come into modern Druidry and paganism, I think, from Wales, which is the Dumb Supper, which is basically a meal that is eaten in silence and in reverse. So you start with the dessert and you work your way backwards, and you don't speak. And there's a bell rung at the beginning and there's a bell rung at the end. And the idea is that a place is set for the ancestors and that the ancestors are invited back. Just something as simple as putting a candle in the window to guide your ancestors back home. A lot of Druid ritual, circle ritual at this time of year, consciously invites the ancestors into the circle to share heat, to share food, offerings, things like honey, wine, salt, and are made to the ancestors. And then they are quite firmly but politely invited to leave again. So all of these things, memorial services, there's various ceremonies that I've attended where, for example, each person will speak a little bit about somebody that they've lost, and then light a candle and put that candle on a tray, so that by the end you've got trays with candles that represent the other world, because they represent the other people, the people that are on the other side of that divide. And then they're remembered, they're invited in, they're acknowledged and thanked. And of course, the phrase "what is remembered lives," which is everywhere in paganism, particularly in Druidry. This idea that as long as somebody is spoken about, there is a sense in which they're still living and that they're still with us. And so it's important at Samhain to speak about the dead, to remember them, to tell their songs. So bringing back folklore and folk tradition. If you're telling ancient stories and you're singing ancient songs, then you are honouring the dead by doing the things that they did. So all of these, I mean, a lot of pagans do a lot of the traditional Halloween things. They go trick-or-treating, they decorate their causes, but at the heart of it, there is this quiet, sort of solemn, reflective, and of course, remembering your own mortality, remembering that you are going to be where they are, and that there is this reciprocal relationship, that the dead and the living are two sides of the same coin. And if you believe in reincarnation, which a lot of pagans do, then it's something that rotates. So, you know, you rotate between being an ancestor and being alive. And it's a time certainly for reflection, and it's a time for thinking about your own mortality. So the fun and the celebration and the quiet and the solemn, I think, probably more than any other festival, they're really interlocked at Samhain for pagans.
So what do you think is the how can I frame it? So what do you think that Samhain teaches about death to pagans? I mean, what's the lesson that Samhain has for pagans when it comes to death?
It's going to vary hugely because, of course, pagans have many, many different beliefs about death and about what comes after death. There is no pagan belief about death. I said a lot of pagans believe in reincarnation. When I say a lot, my research, such as it was, suggested that a lot means about 40%. So, you know, it's not even a majority. So it will very much depend on how they see mortality and death. A lot of pagans would take from it this idea that there is no division, that the living and the dead are innately connected in some way and continue to be of benefit to each other through the wisdom of the ancestors, which some pagans believe they can access through ritual, through offerings at altars. A lot of pagans have altars to their ancestors that they make offerings at, through journeying, through meditation, and also, you know, reciprocally through making those offerings, through telling those people's stories, through keeping them alive, that there is this relationship that we've forgotten about. We've forgotten about our dead. We've tried to push them out. We've tried to build this wall that keeps them outside, where we don't have to think about it, where we don't have to think about death. And the message of Christianity is very triumphalist. The message of Christianity is that there is no death really, because death has been overcome. And for pagans, I think the message is much more, no, death hasn't been overcome. You can't overcome death because it is part of the fabric of reality. It's part of existence. Without death, you don't have life. Without death, you don't have birth. And so these are things that are intricately connected and that you need to develop. You will do much better if you develop a relationship with it, rather than seeing it as something as alien and removed and something that has to be overcome. And so I think very often death is presented in paganism not as an enemy, not as something to be feared and overcome and taken out, but as something that needs to be, while it is frightening, something that needs to be accommodated and befriended, and that you need to have a relationship with in order to live a life that is more full and more meaningful and more connected. So to me, I would say that is the lesson of Samhain. Make friends with your dead.
Be friends with your dad. Your dad. Hear my Italian accent, may play tricks with the dead. That will make it more clearly understandable. But also being friends with death, you know, with the concept of death, and not being in a constant what's the term? Under the pretense that it's never going to happen to you, that it's just something that happens to others, but it's never going to happen to you. But it will. So
yes,
that's the one certainty of life. So sorry, you were saying?
I was just saying, absolutely, is the one certainty. And I think there is a danger that not only Christian, but also secular society that is so death denying and tries to live as if it doesn't happen, as if it's not there. And the British in particular are, and you'll know this having seen, you know, graveyards in Italy, we are very good at building walls around graveyards and pretending they're not there. We don't use them as social places. We don't go and dress the graves. We don't go and put candles on them at certain times of the year. And I think we're very much the poorer for it. We try and build this wall and pretend that death isn't there and that it isn't real. And to some extent, that means that we're always running scared because we've never really made peace with it.
In Italy is different because well, the whole October, obviously there's this is the time of the year that is dedicated to that, especially the 2nd of November, and that's the particular date. But all October and up until the 2nd of November, there are people just lots of people going to cemeteries and dressing the grave and putting flowers and candles and it's really a social event in a way. In a way, it also becomes difficult because if when you have to go to the cemetery in October or early November, you will not find parking and it's going to be really crowded. So you would imagine, just going to the cemetery and having this peaceful connection with your, departed ones. But then there's crowds and crowds of people, flowers everywhere. So it's it's definitely something that happens in Italy in the whole of October up until the 2nd of November.
Yeah.
So even though the day that is dedicated to the dead in Italy is the 2nd of November, but that seems to be like the concluding act. It's a bit like Christmas, right? That you kind of celebrate up until the day of Christmas. But beforehand, you have all the celebrations and all the dinners and gatherings and all of that. It's similar with the celebrations of the dead.
Yeah, which is something else I think we've got wrong here. I think we ought to start celebrating Christmas a lot later and keep celebrating it for a lot longer. I mean, I think 6th of January, stop Christmas on the 6th of January. But yeah,
that's what happens. That's what happens in Italy.
See,
in Italy,
you've got it sussed. You've got it much better than we have. We've just built these walls everywhere, and this going to the graveyard and spending time with your dead. It's where we actually have a graveyard, and of course that's a whole different question. The whole issue of cremation and burial and all of that, different conversation. But to actually go and spend time with your dead, it's something that we are the poorer, I think, because we don't do it, and I don't think we've ever really done it particularly. And most of the rest of Europe does it much better than we do.
So I guess that we can conclude our conversation here. And I think it was a great conversation. Thank you so much, Jenny, for coming over and talking all things Samhain. And I hope to see you on the channel soon.
Yes, it'd be lovely.
Thank you so much again. And for all of you guys, I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. And if you did, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you will never miss anything from me. And if you have the means and want to support my project, which is a crowd-funded project of delivering free academic scholarship based on peer-reviewed research to all of you, I would really appreciate it if you consider supporting my work on PayPal, Patreon, Coffee. On my website, you will find my services and ways to donate to the project. So you'll find all the links pretty much everywhere, bio, cards, info box. So I hope that you consider doing that. And also, please share this video around or any of your videos around. I'd really hope to get to 100K by the end of the year. So please, please, please help me with that. You would be amazing if you just shared my videos everywhere. And thank you so much for being here. I really hope that you stay tuned for all the academic fun. Bye for now.